Chapter 3. So this is our cell biology chapter, getting the basic functions of a cell. I'm going to do this in two parts. The first one focusing on the plasma membrane, and then the second video is going to focus on all the different organelles. So let's look at the cell surface. So we're focusing on the plasma membrane, stuff that makes up the plasma membrane, and all the extensions that come off of the plasma membrane surface. So in our little picture here, they're kind of highlighting the whole cell versus like a little cutout of the cell. So we're focusing just on the outside portions of the cell, and then in the second video I'll start talking about what goes on the inside portions. So the plasma membrane is the border of the cell outside surface area. It's made up of what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So if you remember from chapter 2, we talked about the phospholipid molecule where you have a glycerol that has two fatty acid chains attached to it, and instead of a third one like a triglyceride, the third one instead is a phosphate group, and there's also another attachment to that. So we have our phosphate head, and then we have our two fatty acid tails. So when we create this layer, job of it is to define the cell boundary. So at the bottom here we have two different cells, and these railroad track type of lines here are the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the outside surface of the top cell and the outside surface of the bottom cell. So it's also going to govern what can go in and out the cell and control what can actually, interactions with other cells. So in between these two railroad tracks, you're going to have either possibly cell adhesion molecules. Sometimes you have some communication going on in between cells. And then lastly, what can go in and out of a cell. So a more basic look at our plasma membrane. We have our hydrophilic region, which is the intercellular space or intercellular fluid. Sometimes you'll see it, or also extracellular, just in between the cells or outside the cell, that kind of fluid. That's hydrophobic, so it's a water aqueous type of environment. So that's where our phosphate heads are going to point out towards that environment. This middle portion is hydrophobic. So hydrophobic meaning it doesn't like water. So this is where all of our fatty acid tails are located, as well as the hydrophobic regions of, for example, these different types of proteins that are hanging out in that layer, as well as these little cholesterol molecules. Last region is, again, hydrophilic, which is our intracellular area. Intracellular fluid is water-based, so we have another layer where this is the phosphate heads are pointing towards that. So our fatty acid tails, they point inward toward each other to create that hydrophobic environment because the fatty acids are lipids. So just focusing on the phospholipids, so they are amphipathic, which means they have a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic region. So we have our hydrophilic phosphate head as well as our hydrophobic fatty acid tails. So with these phospholipids, they kind of just hang out in the cell membrane. They're not stuck in one particular area. So if you've ever had a bunch of helium-filled balloons for like a birthday party or something, and you just released them to hang out in the ceiling until you needed them, and then the ribbon coming off of your balloon was just hanging down from the ceiling, that's kind of what a phosphate lipid does. It just kind of bumbles along in your membrane and can move around. So your cell membrane, your plasma membranes aren't actually stiff. They actually are fluid. So in order to keep it from being just complete fluid, you also have cholesterol hanging out inside your plasma membrane. So that just helps to stiffen the membrane and give it a little bit more structural support. Also stuck in our phospholipid bilayer, we have glycolipids. So this is part carbohydrate for the glyco portion and then part lipid. So this is a phospholipid that has a carbohydrate chain sticking off the top of it. So many of these phospholipid with these attachments make up what's called your glycocalyx. So this is really, you're going to get more detail of this for chapter 21 and AP2, but it does mention a little bit here for our purposes for AP1. So this is what tells our cells this cell belongs to our actual body versus what belongs to a foreign invader. Or if you get like a organ transplant, that person's glycocalyx is going to be different from yours because our glycocalyx pattern is determined by our DNA. So unless you have an identical twin, you have a unique signature for this carbohydrate chain pattern. And so your body knows, oh, this is a cell that belongs to me, don't attack it, versus it sees a different pattern and it attacks that different pattern. So unless you have a autoimmune disorder, you should be pretty good. Also stuck in our plasma membrane, we have different membrane proteins. So some proteins, they actually go through the entirety of our phospholipid bilayer. So just like our bilayer, we have hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions. So in the amino acids that make up these proteins, the ones that are here with the rest of the hydrophilic region are also hydrophilic. But the proteins that make up this middle portion structure are hydrophobic. So that allows them to be inserted into the plasma membrane and it actually works. You also have some where they just kind of drift around the membrane just like your phospholipids, so that's also fluid, but some are actually anchored to your internal structure on the inside of your plasma membrane. So there's a cell structure called a microfilament. So it's made up of actin proteins that helps to give our cells their shape. Part of it. They have also two other types of cell cytoskeleton proteins. But if you anchor this protein to that cytoskeleton, that protein's not going to go anywhere. And sometimes you need that if you're anchored in a particular position because you're attached to another cell or because you need to be easily accessed for certain functions of the cell. So some of that anchoring is necessary. You also have what's called peripheral proteins. So not all of your proteins actually go through your plasma membrane. Some are just hanging out on one side of your plasma membrane. So for example, this protein that anchors this integral protein, it's hanging out on one side of your phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so with our membrane proteins, they have a variety of different jobs. So for your exam where in the study guide I say know the membrane proteins and their functions, I want you to know this little chart here. So first type is a receptor. The job of the receptor is to receive some type of chemical messenger. So something that's released from another cell, it flows through the bloodstream or just through maybe a nearby cell. That messenger binds to the receptor and that receptor is going to cause some kind of change in the cell. Eventually you want to stop that change. So the receptor will release that chemical messenger and then you have some proteins that their job is to break down that messenger so you don't continue to have that initial signal keep going in the cell. You maybe only needed it for a short term. So these are enzymes and they're going to break down that chemical messenger. So later when we talk about muscles, we do have enzymes that help to break down some of the chemical messenger for muscle contraction called acetylcholine. The acetylcholine esterase enzyme keeps us from having abnormal muscle contraction. So if you're riding something, you only want your hand to move a certain way, it's only going to move for that distance instead of continuing to have that same muscle contraction. So that's what they're for. Next type are channels. So we have two different types of channels, both of these little purple ones here. We have open channels that just allow for whatever is passing through that channel just to continue to go through. So some are just constantly open. So for example, in this case of the ions, able to go down their concentration gradient. Some channels are gated. So in gated channels, they actually have to be open. So sometimes it's because of mechanical reasons. Sometimes the channel is also a receptor, so that chemical messenger has to bind, so it allows for the channel to open so that your ion or other substance that that channel allows will be able to go down its concentration gradient. Next one is the cell identity marker. So we talked about this a little bit part. So they're part of your glycocalyx, determining that this cell actually belongs to your body. Please don't attack me. So that's pretty much their own job. Kind of boring. Oh well. The last one is the cell adhesion molecule. So later when we talk about in chapter 5 what's called tissues, there are cells that are the same type of cell. They work together, they stick together, they have some kind of function together. And so to keep the cells together, they do have adhesion molecules so that it keeps the cells together to do their job. So they're able to communicate with each other and do the function of that tissue. Okay, so here is more text version of what I just said. Different types of channels, how they're open for your gated ones. So either a chemical messenger, change in voltage, or a mechanical, like literally gets pulled open to have that channel to open. Okay, I'm gonna skip through this portion. Okay, glycocalyx, talked about it and its function. Okay, so off of our plasma membrane, we do have certain structures that help to increase the surface area of our plasma membrane. So for example, in your small intestines, after you've had your meal, your stomach breaks it down to a liquid form, your small intestines is going to absorb those nutrients. So to make it easier, we have these cell extensions called microvilli. They create what's called a brush border. So these just make more surface area, makes it easy to get those nutrients into the cell. So it's kind of like when you go to Walmart and there's like only 2 checkout counters open. Microvilli would be as if they opened up all the checkout lines and you're able to easily get out the store and check out with your item. So it just makes things a whole lot faster. Another plasma membrane extension is the cilia, and most of what they're going to do is they're doing some kind of movement. So we'll talk about this more in AP2, but for example, when in your respiratory system, there's mucus there, the cilia, they kind of beat like waves in order to move the mucus from your respiratory system, so your major airways, move it up to the back of your throat, and then you just end up swallowing it. That's okay, because it's so thin that you don't realize it's there unless you're sick and it's clogged up with a bunch of other junk from your illness, and then that's why it's all the gunky stuff that you cough up. Okay. So here's a more detailed slide about the cilia and how they work. So you actually can see moving mucus along. It also works in your reproductive system to move egg and sperm along their ducts. So same thing, the cilia, they push forward and then they kind of flap up like those little puppets at a car dealership. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I'm actually going to do 3 videos for chapter 3. I thought I was going to pull it off in 2. Nope, that's not happening because we need more time for this section for membrane transport. So go ahead and watch part 2 for chapter 3.